Thank you so much. It's great to see so many people here to listen to the words that have already come already. And I'm very much excited to hear what's coming next. To that end, I'm really not going to keep you for long. Jessie Wendt, broadcaster, curator, producer, activist, obviously a public speaker. I'm really excited to hear this, so I don't want to keep you. Welcome to this week, and please, Jessie, take it away. Thank you so much on behalf of Indigenous Studies.
Thank you very much, Adrienne. And look at all you wonderful people all here. Isn't this delightful? As has been suggested, my name is Jessie Wendt. I'm Anishinaabe Ojibwe. I was born in Toronto. My family, my dad's side of my family comes from a small place called Chicago. And my mom's side of the family comes from a metropolis known as the Serpent River First Nation, which is also named Ganabajing, on the north shore of Lake Huron, where my ancestors have been for, a while, and still are. Still lots of family there. I'm Bear Clan, and I'm really delighted to be here. In terms of my professional existence, I guess what's relevant is I'm the executive director of the Indigenous Screen Office, and I'm also chair of the Canada Council for the Arts. And I'm going to talk today about, we've heard mention already of sovereignty, food sovereignty, sovereignty. I'm going to talk about narrative sovereignty. They're all interrelated. And I'm going to talk about that as really the policy, the baseline of the policy that the ISO tends to advocate for. And the reason why the ISO exists is as a sovereignty-based organization. And just by way of introduction, if people don't know what the Indigenous Screen Office actually is, it was established in 2017 by the Federal Heritage Minister. This came after a couple of solid decades of advocacy on the part of Indigenous screen storytellers in Canada for the founding of the office. The advocacy started roughly the day after Australia announced that they were establishing an Indigenous Screen Office, which was about 25 years or so ago. There were numerous reports over the years that called for, they didn't necessarily name the Indigenous Screen Office a name, although the most recent one did. What they tended to call for was increased resources for Indigenous storytellers that were to be administered by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. And then most recently, the CMF report in 2016 called for the founding of the Screen Office, and that is what the federal government was responding to. I came on as the first employee in 2018. And if you just saw the recent federal budget in 2021, we were allocated $40 million over 3 years to continue our work supporting Indigenous screen storytellers and the pursuit of our narrative sovereignty within the Canadian screen sector. So what we mean by, well, first of all, why narrative sovereignty? And I think this is certainly a key question that we are often asked. And the answer is simple, which is that Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples are not equity-seeking groups in the way that we often hear about in equity work. As it defined, we are sovereignty-seeking groups. And this is a very different position in terms of seeking solutions that may look like equity, but actually form around sovereignty. And of course, the reason why Indigenous peoples are sovereignty seeking is that, well, we were sovereign nations before Canada. That never actually stopped. We never ceded sovereignty in any of the agreements with Canada, including all the historical treaties. So we are still sovereign nations, just under the occupation of a settler colonial state. So we seek sovereignty just as in all aspects: food, politics, personal, political, and narrative. And that there's a legal framework for this because Indigenous peoples, First Nations people, are in the Constitution in 6 of 35 as founding nations of Canada. That allows us a legal framework with which to advocate for sovereignty, since we see it, as I'll get into, we see that actually Canada is very, very, very familiar with the concept of narrative sovereignty, because it has lots of laws and policies to make sure that it has its own. And we can get into that in a second. So this is why we ultimately argue from a sovereignty, or advocate from a sovereignty framework, when it comes to storytelling and the resources that should be available and how those should be allocated. And what do we specifically mean by narrative sovereignty is we mean measures of control. So we're talking about, in the way the screen sector has defined it, is very right along the same lines as how Canadian defines its own narrative sovereignty in the screen space, which is around ownership of underlying IP and the production rights, and then creative control. So basically, who owns the story and who is telling the story. In order to be qualified as Canadian, those people have to be Canadian. And then you can access the Canadian funding system. Ultimately, narrative sovereignty is extraordinarily important to settler colonial states, as it is among the largest measures of actual sovereignty that they control, along with the ongoing occupation of the lands. And what I mean is that, Canada has always been very conscious of enforcing its own narrative sovereignty as part of ongoing colonialism in this land, that it is the storytelling that Canada does about itself that helps reinforce the notion of its sovereignty. That and the occupation of the lands are actually its primary forces of how it reinforces that, and then through the courts. We know the importance of this, not only because Canada is so protective of its own narrative sovereignty, but Indigenous peoples are incredibly familiar with the importance of this idea because of how our narrative sovereignty has been systematically attacked and stripped from us by the Canadian state over the years. And how did Canada do this? Well, I mean, it was actually in all the ways people already know of how our sovereignty was lost. Residential schools, obviously, and attacking language and distancing from family meant that stories were disrupted, and the national stories of our nations were interrupted and attacked. We know through the Indian Act that attacks on our land and our identity also undermined our abilities to tell our national stories. Because of course, key to underline the why there is narrative sovereignty to begin with is that nations always have a story to tell about themselves, right? They all have a creation story. The Anishinaabe, my people, have a creation story. It's why Turtle Island, that's why we call this place Turtle Island, is our creation story. And Canada has one as well, which, is, depending on your point of view, about as, historically and scientifically accurate as the notion of an enormous turtle, being underneath all the land. I actually put a lot more faith in the turtle being there, frankly. But there, just as it to say that is that in national narrative building, when we build stories around nations, they are a mixture of myth and fact, and that we have to discern which is which if we're going to set policy. And so Canada is always very sure to insist on its own narrative sovereignty, and we know that they made sure to limit it for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people here. Perhaps the most obvious attack on this was the famous potlatch ban that was instituted in 1884 and lasted until 1951 here in Canada. If you're unfamiliar with what this law was, is that it's named potlatch after a very specific ceremony that takes place among many of the West Coast nations here on Turtle Island. Although it wasn't exclusive to the potlatch, it banned pretty much any ceremony that Indigenous people would want to have. our stories are embedded in the ceremonies. They are an act of storytelling of that sort of narrative nationhood that we've talked about. And if you think of the stretch from 1884 to 1951, not only does this stretch encompass the height, the peak of the residential school system. So while culture is actually outlawed in our nations, because this is what the Potlatch Band effectively did, it made it illegal for us to perform our ceremonies in our own communities. And in fact, made it illegal even for us to have our own ceremonial artifacts, which is why those were then taken and placed in museums all around the world, including in Canada, and contextualized by non-Indigenous people for a non-Indigenous audience. And this was also the time period that most of the major Canadian cultural institutions, and indeed the foundation of Canadian cultural policy, was in fact enacted. So if you think of, I don't know, pretty much any major museum or art gallery in Canada, the oldest ones, they all date back to about this period. If you think of the CBC or the National Film Board, they were all founded during this period when, again, it was literally illegal for Indigenous people to tell stories in our communities. The only legal place for Indigenous people to do that was for non-Indigenous audiences or by non-Indigenous people. The Canada Council for the Arts is another example of a narrative sovereignty institute, Canadian narrative sovereignty institution, was founded just after this, the Potlatch Band ended. So it was founded in 1957. But to give you the idea of what it meant, when the Canada Council was founded in 1957, Indigenous arts were ineligible for funding. So our stories were not eligible. Indigenous artists were eligible if they wanted to participate in a colonial or Western art form. So if you wanted to be a traditional ballet dancer or a cellist playing European music, then you might qualify. But if you wanted to do anything that was traditional to us, traditional art practice for us, it was ineligible. And it was during this time, of course, that Canada was at its peak in terms of helping to establish its own narrative sovereignty infrastructure. That's all the institutions that we see. And we know that colonial states are very protectionist of their own narrative sovereignty. We see this not just in Canada, but all over France, England. They all have similar policies. They all tend to congregate around issues of ownership and creative control. They're all meant to protect the native industries against the global industry that the streamers, by the way, because I will eventually get to the streaming folks, the streamers represent the sort of most peak form of at the current moment. But the same reasons why Canadian has cultural policy, right? Canada developed cultural policy, to distance itself somewhat from its colonial parent state, and also to be protectionist against what it felt was the largest threat, the sort of cultural industry or industrial production that we see south of the border in the US. So while colonial states are very good at protecting their own narrative sovereignty, they have quite done the opposite for Indigenous nations. They have actually they have passed policy to undermine and threaten our own narrative sovereignty, in part because they're, colonial states in general view any Indigenous sovereignty movement, whether it's narrative, food, any of them, as threatening to their own sovereignty. It, of course, is the exact opposite, but that is part of the framework that we have to exist in. Now, one of the reasons that the ISO is interested in narrative sovereignty, well, there's many reasons that we can get into. I mean, some of it is that these are, there's a history, in the film industry or the TV industry. Indigenous peoples are among the most portrayed communities in the history of the moving image. Yet the vast majority, and by vast, I mean in the 99th percentile, of those were not created by Indigenous people. So when it comes to this specific sector, and would also be true of our portrayals in pretty much any other sector, although I'm not as versed in theatrical or dance history. Maybe Santi would know better, but I'm not as versed in those. I do know that in film history, this is very, very true. That we have suffered the consequences of that, that our stories not being told by us has undermined our actual sovereignty, has undermined our efforts to retain and maybe bring back our own sovereignty. It's undermined our physical health. It's undermined our safety on these nations. It's been used to dehumanize us, which allows for some of the gross disparities in a lot of health and outcomes, social justice outcomes that we see. It's not to say the fact that we've lost narrative sovereignty is why we have persistent disparities in, say, access to drinking water in Canada or the prison system. But the fact that we haven't been able to tell our stories is part and parcel in why we have been so easily dehumanized in colonial states, as part of the necessity of colonial states to do that in order to excuse their history and to create their own narrative. They need to obscure that history and that narrative. And it's just been incredibly damaging. And while the retention or regaining of narrative sovereignty for Indigenous people won't resolve all of those issues, it will allow us on a pathway to, because it will allow us to be humanized in a way that it should make these disparities even more grotesque and harder for the general public to allow by their political parties. So the key part of narrative sovereignty is that it will allow us to humanize, and that this is good not just for us, but also, frankly, for Canada. And this is part that I think is really important to understand. So when I talked a little bit about why the ISO is interested in narrative sovereignty, why Indigenous people are in narrative sovereignty, there's a few reasons. As we've seen just in this past, couple of years, especially maybe in the pandemic, the appetite for moving image content does not go down. It's been on a pretty steady trajectory up since, Edison first showed moving images in 1894. It's been a steady increase in human interest in moving images. And in fact, we're at a point now where there's more moving image content created and consumed on the planet than at any other point in human history. So there's a vast industry, industrialization that is occurring, and rightfully so. Indigenous peoples want to make sure that we have access to that industry for a number of reasons. One, it presents economic opportunity that does not require the same sort of environmental devastation or environmental compromise, shall we put it more politely, perhaps, that many of the other extractionist resources have demanded when we see them emerge or take root on our lands. So I think there's an opportunity there for participation in that industry that is a growth industry for Indigenous peoples that has a lot of benefits, both in terms of our humanization and our ability to have narrative sovereignty, but also economic in nature, environmental, possibly in nature. But I would be, I've never seen storytelling as a purely economic or industrial imperative. I might in fact argue that economics have tended to undermine and create more problems in storytelling than they have actually resolved anything. And storytelling as an industry has been remarkably resilient to all manner of disruption, whether it be changes, technological advancement, changes in population, or, as we've just seen in the last year, changes in how we communicate and how we behave. It's not like COVID has made storytelling less valuable. In fact, it's made it more valuable. It's more valuable than ever that we connect and we tell these stories. It's changed the mode, perhaps, but it hasn't changed the underlying, the inherent value of storytelling. And I mean beyond sort of any economic measure. And so when I think of the real point of narrative sovereignty for Indigenous peoples, frankly, it's the same as sovereignty for Indigenous peoples, and these are interrelated. I don't see how we will gain our political and physical sovereignty without having narrative sovereignty. And I don't see how we'll have narrative sovereignty if we aren't also fighting for our political and physical sovereignty on these lands. But that this is in fact not at all a threat to Canadian sovereignty, which seems like an odd trick, but it isn't. That in fact for Canada to reach its sort of ideal state as a state is in recognition of Indigenous sovereignty, that it's in the creation of a sort of new partnership that is required in order for Canada to secure its own sovereignty, is actually a pathway through the recognition of our own. And so, because I think the end that we're often seeking is not as policy driven as perhaps this conference would want, or as often I couch my language in, because the goals I have are not, I'm happy to discuss policy if they're, to advance a specific goal. And the goal is, I want Canada to be a safer and better place for Indigenous folks to continue to exist, since we're unlikely to go anywhere. And since it's unlikely, well, we haven't gone anywhere like in thousands of years. So, I mean, if we're going to go on history, it seems like we're here to stay. And everyone else is also here. And again, our ancestors welcomed this. So, in keeping with that, we have to figure out how to make this work better. And so I do think the national narrative, the story that Canada tells itself, has to fundamentally change. And the fundamental part that has to change about it is how it understands its ongoing relationship with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And for that narrative to change, it requires us to start telling that story. Canada has told its story over and over again. And it's been taught in classrooms for generations. It has led us to the point where we have to have these conversations today. So I think it is important that we acknowledge that maybe we need to shift the story we tell about ourselves if we want outcomes to fundamentally change. And so really that's at the core of what at least my work is doing, and how I see my work at the ISO, is that it's out of an interest to see Canada be a better place. As much as Canada's harmed my family and my peoples, my family also imagined that Canada could be a place where our communities lived in right relations with one another. So I don't want to do disservice to that vision either, by giving up entirely on the state of Canada. But I think the state of Canada requires to do some pretty heavy lifting if it wants to set those relations back into a right place. So in terms of how we see this narrative sovereignty present itself in legislation, it's interesting to consider, one small measure we saw in the changes to the Broadcasting and Telecommunications Act that have been proposed by the government. If you're familiar with the Act, the last time it was amended, there was language added around Indigenous broadcasting and Indigenous storytelling. And the language, I think, was meant to be inclusive. It was, the language was basically that there should be Aboriginal broadcasting when resources become available. It had this qualifier that occurred right after. By the way, I'm the one doing the quotations part. It wasn't like that in the Act. They didn't have the quotations part. But it said when resources became available. Well, I mean, spoiler alert, they never became available. So the closest we got was the founding of APTN about 21 years or so ago. APTN was founded by the CRTC. It's important to keep in mind. It was actually the CRTC that helped create it after much advocacy from the community for there to be an Indigenous network. Other than that, we've seen incremental resources become available really just in the last 6 or 7 years, both at the main funding bodies for audiovisual content, that would be Telefilm and the CMF. We really haven't seen a coherent Indigenous strategy by the CBC, which is the single largest Canadian narrative sovereignty entity that they created. The NFB does have a stated Indigenous strategy that they are working through. So very minor with the whole when resources became available thing. I'm going to be generous because I was not, I must admit, when this was created in 1990 or 91, I would have been, in high school. I wasn't really paying attention to broadcasting policy in Canada at the time. So I'm going to be generous and say that they didn't mean it to mean that resources would never become available. They were going to be optimistic there, but in function, it meant that resources never became available. So there was no compulsion for the creation of an Indigenous broadcasting sector. That language has been dropped from the most recent proposed amendments. This was certainly what the ISO and our community was advocating for, that the language be dropped, which would mean suddenly that the Broadcasting Act is now compelling there to be Indigenous broadcast sector in a way that it wasn't before, because it's saying very much like it says, not quite as close as we would like, but very similar to the way it says that there should be a French and English broadcast sector. Now it sort of similarly says there should be an Indigenous one. And that law is what has allowed us to have the Canadian Media Fund, to have Telefilm, to have these funding bodies which exist to fulfill the requirements that exist under the Broadcasting Act for the broadcasters. So this was, as, how would I put it? How can I put this politely? As complex is how I'll put it, as the proposed amendments are, and their long-term impacts on our sector, because I'm sure that's something you folks will get into in this conference later. That particular change we're certainly all in supportive of. We think that will mean that broadcasters will have to have an Indigenous component or Indigenous storytelling in order to exist in Canada. This is good. This is what helps form an actual sector to exist. And when it comes to the age of streamers, because I realize I need to get to that. I think it's interesting to consider the proposition of narrative sovereignty in an age of streaming services that exist on a global level, not necessarily on a national level. And even if you take this just strictly out of movie and image content and just think of cultural policy in the age of sort of global cultural entities like the streaming services, I think it actually behooves all countries, all nations, including First Nations, Métis and Inuit nations, to think that this actually requires even more support for national storytelling and support for national storytelling services, not less. And that there's a couple of reasons for this. One, global streamers have shown to have a ravenous appetite, not dissimilar to their extractionist colleagues in other major industries. Let's be honest. I mean, they will buy everything, and they're not really that interested in preservation of existing ecosystems or business models. They're interested in complete dominance, and not just of, certainly for some of them, not just of the content we consume, Some of them are interested in dominance over, you know, most of our interactions with the digital world. If you think of vertically integrated companies like Amazon or Facebook and Google, they're not just interested in you streaming the latest show. They're interested in mitigating your entire interactions through the internet. You know, they want the internet of Google, the internet of Amazon, where everything you do is strictly through their service. And I think it's actually incredibly important that countries like Canada actually see that and respond to that threat by investing in our own infrastructure and our own ability to create our own stories. Now, the interesting thing is that we can take advantage of audience behavior on a lot of these streaming services, which is, you know, there's been a lot of discussion, and I'm going to drift off into content production just for a second, but there's a lot of discussion in our sector around, you know, making content, globalizing your content. So you basically make, you know, the example everyone loves to use because everyone knows these movies, even though I will admit to not really watching them, which is the Fast and the Furious movies. So people who've seen them will smile and know what I'm talking about. I haven't really, you know, I'm no longer a paid film critic. So movies that I don't want to see and no longer get paid to see, I skip. And so I haven't really seen the Fast and the Furious movies, but they're made in this sort of global marketplace. So they have, you know, they want to sell through to China as well as America, as well as every human being. They want to stream these movies. So they don't really have any nationality about them other than being capitalist. That's perhaps the closest to their national identity those films ultimately get. But if you actually look at what shows are most successful, what shows break through, those are hugely successful in a specific model. But a lot of it, of the shows that are actually very successful, are extremely culturally specific. They're not global in their presentation. They're actually very local in their presentation. But of course, the trick is, and we've always known this about storytelling, is that the very local is actually ubiquitous among humanity. The small things that we think of as local concerns, everyone has them. We all share these small little things. So when you make a show that is actually specific, look at Kim's Convenience, just as an example of a show that's done extremely well. Or again, that's because that corner store exists everywhere. So or interactions that people can relate to exist anywhere. So this is why actually I'm urging, or I would continue to urge our government to invest in cultural creation from a Canadian, from a First Nations, Métis and Inuit, and indeed from all of what Canadian should represent, which is a whole lot of different communities and cultures, and lean into that specificity, lean into the idea of Canadian content because it's Canadian, and trust that our experiences are not so dissimilar from other people's in the worlds that these can travel. And we see that they are, whether it's Letterkenny, or we have the ability to make content that succeeds on the global level by taking advantage of what's specific about Canadian. And again, this would lead me back to the importance of allowing Indigenous storytellers to have their own narrative sovereignty, to have creative sovereignty over how they tell their stories. Because when we think about what is culturally specific to Canada, well, if I think of cultures that say you can only find on Turtle Island, well, that's the First Nations, Métis and Inuit folks, right? Those are the cultures that are actually distinct to this place, right? That you don't have in other parts of the global community. And yet those stories are also an untapped resource because they have been suppressed for so long. So we have this incredibly rich storytelling history that is largely I'll use big square quotes for this because colonial folks, or the history of colonialism, loves this, stories that are undiscovered by colonial nations because they haven't heard them before. We should be empowered to now bring these forth, not just because it's interesting. Entering the economy allows us to tap into an industry. All of that is hugely beneficial, and we should. but also, quite frankly, because it's time for these stories to surface. We are looking at, a lot of challenges in our relationships with each other, relationships with the earth, that these stories can help center. And if we listen to them and understand them and allow Indigenous peoples to tell them in their way, as often for ourselves as much as anyone else, that these are incredibly important stories, and that these stories can help reshift how we view our relationships with each other and the systems that support human existence on the planet. And that this is actually perhaps the most urgent thing for us right now. We're in the midst of a pandemic. Our systems did not react well to it. So what are we going to do about it? What is the story we're going to tell? That we need to reform and rebuild systems that didn't work? Or should we tell different stories to try to create new systems that will actually respond, so that there is equity when these crises occur? Because there will be other crises. We are in several ongoing crises even before the pandemic ever hit. All the pandemic has done is reassert the need for these movements to occur, and for a fundamental storytelling change to take place, to allow us the space in our imaginations to picture new policy solutions and new policy outcomes, and to imagine that we're not beholden to the same systems that have led us to have to seek these same policy initiatives and outcomes. It's bananas to me that that's sometimes how we think. Oh, this led us here, let's use it to get back out. I'm not sure. It's a bit like climbing up a very slick slide. Once you've gone down it, it can be, that doesn't mean you can't do it. It's just the ladder might be the better way to get out of the same position. And so ultimately, I think narrative sovereignty, of course, is central to the ongoing struggle for sovereignty for Indigenous peoples. But I actually think in the age of the streamers, it has become an incredibly important consideration, even for the colonial states who have done such a job at undermining Indigenous narrative sovereignty in favor of their own. Because a global marketplace, one driven largely by capitalist-centered algorithms, does not really care about the borders that colonial nation states have erected for themselves. They are famously the head of the CBC once compared Netflix to, I think, French imperialism in India, which is a terrible comment. But I think what it underlines is that colonial nation states, the thing they fear the most is to be colonized. If one only needs to read their own stories to understand how deeply they fear having done to them what they have done to others. This, watch any movie about an alien invasion. That's what it's literally about. And so they fear this same framework without seeing the opportunity of being specific about our own place on the planet and how that can feed in and not be as terrified about global networks when what we are feeding them is specific content to the places that we reside. So resisting the temptation to meet a global marketplace with global created content, and instead meet that marketplace with local community-based content as a way to, and I hate using content, stories. Can we just say stories? That's way better. Content is awful. When we meet, so in other words, use what the systems that they've created, but not to their end, to our own end. The streamers ultimately will do what is profitable, what garners audience. And that doesn't have to be stuff that is non-specific. It can be stuff that is very specific. And I think that's what we should be leaning into. Our cultural policy should be about creating more of it, allowing more self-determination for Indigenous peoples, making sure that more communities are present. Because again, if we allow for diverse communities in Canadian content, that will be more reflective of the global marketplace we're talking about. So that will actually bring them to our own stories in a way that just clinging to this sort of algorithmic production designs, I don't think ultimately will. So in this way, I think narrative sovereignty has actually become a common cause for many of us. And central to how Canada can secure a zone is A, making sure that Indigenous peoples have ours. Again, these are complementary things, and that will indeed allow Canada to then to assert its own in a much more forceful way on the global marketplace in the face of these emerging cultural giants and streaming services. I'm going to stop there, and because I think we're supposed to take Q&A, and I have rambled long enough, but miigwech, chi miigwech for listening.
Thank you so much, Jesse, for that wonderful, wonderful talk. It's just so interesting to hear you talk about the Indigenous Screen Office and Indigenous narrative sovereignty and the importance of that within the big picture of the complex of stories and the history of Canadian storytelling sovereignty within that. I want to invite everyone to put their questions and comments in the chat. And while we're waiting for people to do that, I have something that really kind of struck me about your talk that I just wanted to reflect. I mean, first of all, just to highlight what you said, and what I appreciated, all the communication and cultural policies that this conference deals with were really founded in a time and are tied to Indigenous cultural genocide and white supremacy, and have a history of that needs to be reckoned with. And I think one of the things a concept that interests me is the concept of sovereignty and also relational sovereignty. And to me, like reflecting on that idea in the context of what you've said, it seems to me that there's moments, and maybe the pandemic is one of them, that really exposes the extent to which the state does not necessarily work for Indigenous people or work for us, whoever us is. And as you mentioned, sovereignty comes really from relationships. It comes from assenting to this organization that we're all part of. And you mentioned the role of stories in that. And my kind of thought on that is that stories can do multiple things. Stories, on the one hand, can make us feel good about terrible, relational structures. They can give us false ideas of things and create false legitimacy. But what it sounds like you're suggesting is that stories can also change things because they can almost make a new demand. They can humanize. They can kind of change the policy paradigm that we're working in. And so maybe I'll just ask for you to maybe reflect a little bit on those ideas, and we'll watch for other comments coming in the chat and questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. I think storytelling changes. I think storytelling is all about change, or that it is, and you're right in that it can both be used. It's a tool, right? So it can be used for both good and bad, and humans use it all the time. Storytelling is a distinctly human thing. We are the storytelling animal, in that that is how we understand the whole world is through storytelling. Yes, we do science and all sorts of things, but what's the way we often communicate even those scientific discoveries? We tell a story about them, because that's actually how our brain works. It's much easier for us to understand these concepts when we just tell a story of them. And when I think about, someone mentioned truth and reconciliation, and what is the main central proposal of a truth and reconciliation process? It is about storytelling. It's asking, the truth part is about asking people to tell their story. Typically, the reason you're asking for it in the context of a truth and reconciliation process is because that story has been expressly suppressed or oppressed or excluded or erased. so you have to have a specific process to even get those stories. But if you look at what the intent is then, well, the intent is we hear those stories and we change. We change through reconciliation, through reparations that should be, we don't often talk about reparations, but they should be in direct connection to reconciliation, as an outcome or an output of reconciliation. So yes, we've engaged in it expressly. One of the things pre-pandemic, and even now during the pandemic, although now I do it this, is, I toured the country talking with folks. And what was one of the most common things Canadians would say to me was, I didn't know this. So what they're saying is they hadn't heard that story, right? They didn't know that this story was. And the reason they were telling me this is because they were reflecting that now they had heard that story, they thought differently. They saw the world differently. And seeing the world differently might mean they change. And listen, maybe it's naive for me to think that storytelling can help Canada change. Because maybe, I want to be super optimistic and everything, but, Canada is proven to be very resilient to change or resistance to change. Even during a truth and reconciliation process, it is proven to be very resistant to those ideas. But story is what I have. Story is what I work with. Story is what I love and how I understand the world. It's what I'm passionate about. So that's the arena I work in, and I see the connections between how storytelling has been weaponized against us, about how the denial of our stories has been used to create false ones, right? To ease these things. And that's where I want to then have the fight, is in the arena of stories. That's what I feel equipped to fight with. My sister, who's a lawyer, treaty rights lawyer, she fights with laws and their own laws. We all have our own sort of place to try to advance frankly, the health of our people. And this is where I am. But I think it's absolutely, stories have a huge impact. All we have to do is look at how storytelling has affected how we perceive the pandemic, and how shifts in storytelling and all this have caused confusion or anxiety or poor outcomes, and granted, it's a story that is changing. So the story about it is naturally going to change over time. But this conflict has exacerbated many things. And maybe also to your point, Sarah, we live in a time where storytelling, the amount of it is unbelievable, and not all of it, much of it is being weaponized. It is being used for other outcomes that actually are not sovereignty at all, are about, and we have to be very conscious of that. And to me, the answer to that isn't less storytelling, it's more.
We do have a few questions. Thank you so much. We do have a few questions that have come in the chat. So I'm just going to speak them out, a series of questions, and I'll let you pick out of those which ones you're sort of ready to respond to. One is that I've heard ideas about an Indigenous internet. What does that mean to you, and what would it look like? Another question is, what are your thoughts about how communications folks can reconcile and expand their roles as Indigenous allies in the context of anti-Indigenous racism and indigenizing the academy? How can they move beyond kind of risk and reputation management? Another is, and there's two here, I think, relating to Bill C-10. Should we require the foreign streamers to offer our specific stories as in Bill C-10, or should we seek to develop our own services? Thank you for your thoughts as well. There's a comment on equity and inclusion versus sovereignty and self-determining. That's an important message that needs to be carried. Another question, stop me if there's too many all at once. I'll read you one more. Thank you for your elegant argument, Jesse. I love your proposal to fund local Indigenous stories for their unique and universal accessible stories to hack the globalist media universe. As you're deeply familiar with the CBC, I wonder how you might or might have already pitched that idea to as a funding proposal to CBC or another large media organization in Canada, or as a challenge to CanCon regulations. And I'll keeping an eye on the chat. I'll stop there.
Well, I'll start, I guess, with the last one because it's the freshest. I have not talked to the CBC about that. Haven't talked to any broadcaster about that. It's not really, the way I'm approaching it, given my position, is to create, the ISO will become we're both the carrot and the stick, I would say, is in that we want to offer incentives for folks to engage with Indigenous storytellers by letting Indigenous storytellers empower them to do their own thing and create on their own, and free them a little bit from, because so much of the at least on the screen, the moving image side, so much of the funding in Canada is really based on commercial viability. And for Indigenous folks, this is a bit of a trap because, like, you prevented us from having a sector. Oh, and now you demand that we show that we can. Like, it's a bit of a circular argument that has the effect of just forever keeping us out. So we want to free that up a little bit and just allow Indigenous folks to start telling their stories the way they want. And my prediction will be, because the places like the CBC, and I don't even use their names, like anyone who's has a platform where their thing is broadcasting or disseminating or exhibiting stories, and I tell this to folks all the time, and it's hard because those places love to position themselves as the ones who really are you have to beg them. But the reality is, like, if the folks if Ted Sarandos, who ran Netflix, could think up all of these great stories by himself, he just would, but he can't. So he needs to hire other people to do the storytelling. That's where the power actually belongs in the relationship, not with the people with the microphone. It's the people that can say something into that microphone that are the powerful ones. And so I think if we just empower, and because this is the other falsity that has been largely spread on the cultural side when it comes to Indigenous folks, is that there's not interest in our stories, when there's incredible interest in our stories all over the world. There's this huge interest in the stories, nor is it because of lack of talent that we haven't been telling these stories. There's like enormous talent in our community. It's opportunity that has been the barrier to people seeing these things. So let's create the opportunity. And I just believe, because I know these folks, they'll smell a good story and they will all come. It is not us that has to lure them. The bait is empowering storytellers to be great. You, like locusts, those folks will descend to, and if Canada just did that as a policy, let's focus on what original, thoughtful, visionary storytelling, like unique stuff, not stuff that is sort of market surveyed into existence, stuff that's like unique, visionary stuff. All those folks will immediately come to the table because they desperately need that stuff. So that's how I would sort of see that. There was talk about moving past risk and I think it was regulation, or that is such a that is such a great point, because I think so much of diversity, equity, and inclusion work is actually about risk mitigation, not actually about diversifying or including folks. And you can tell that when they're unwilling to share power. Because if you really want to do this properly, it's sharing the power. That's what narrative sovereignty is about. It's saying, no, you have to give us the power just to do this and not think that you can always do it better. And the thing with sharing power is, in the sort of Western neoliberal capitalist mindset, that's always viewed as you have to lose power to share power. when in fact it's the exact opposite in practice. If you share power, you will only become more powerful. It's a fascinating thing about how the world works, but it is true. So I do think we have to move that by encouraging folks to become accomplices, not necessarily just allies. So help us actually do stuff, not necessarily just praise our way of thought. The Indigenous internet, I heard a question about the Indigenous internet. If I knew what that would look like, I think I'd be in a much nicer house right now. I have no idea what that would look like. There are much smarter people than me, though. Scawanati, I'm thinking of, or Jason Lewis, or Loretta Todd out west, or like there's really huge brains that think all about this all day. We should find them and ask them. My role is to sort of go, great, how can we fund that thing that I don't understand that sounds awesome? That's my role, is to try to make sure that those people have whatever tools they need to create that. I'll flip it to something I do immediately understand. There's been a lot of talk about starting like an Indigenous Netflix, for example, as a way of, again, finding a self-determined space within a larger ecosystem. I'm not opposed to that idea. There is some concern I have as like a functional business idea, whether that would succeed, just because it's, the way these streamers operate, they take a very sort of omnivorous approach, which is it's all about subscriber acquisition, and it's hard to compete against something so large. But we have seen that you can make, there's audience for very niche offerings, and that one of the beauties of our time is that you can be as niche as you want to be, and you can find an audience. And so maybe there is absolutely room for that. In terms of what I imagine an Indigenous internet might mean, it might mean one that seems to be entirely driven for profit and for capitalist ends, which I'm not sure was the original intent of the internet. If I'm not an internet historian or expert, but I am old-ish. So I do remember, like, I lived in pre-internet times, and if I remember the conversations we were having back then, it was like the internet, the whole point of it was to not be capitalist, was to sort of exist beyond that paradigm and to offer a much different exchange of information and ideas and opportunities. Perhaps not surprising in our current systems that it has been entirely overtaken by capitalist concerns, which is fundamentally why I think before we get to an Indigenous internet, and I guess I'll say this, I mean, there might have to be some divestment from our current digital infrastructure, meaning, and I don't mean that from, I mean that from, like, I take my own example. I'm way less on internet platforms today than I was at the beginning of the pandemic. And I would equate that entirely with wanting to be sane and have a mental health that allows me to get up in the morning and parent my 2 children and live with my partner and have a dog that is somewhere right now, probably tearing up my tulips. So yeah, and I don't think that will actually occur in a coordinated way. I think actually humans just are going to start to recognize that some of this really isn't that good for us, and that the reason it isn't good for us isn't inherent in the thing, it's how the thing is being used against us, and that we really should question some of that we have allowed the internet to lose its way by taking the easy road and letting capitalist forces for-profit forces decide what happens on there. And I'm not sure that has been particularly beneficial to the cause of, humanity.
Mm-hmm. I can hardly believe it, but we've already reached the end of the session. Thank you so much for your talk today and for responding to all of the questions. It's a wonderful honor to have you here.